Test J, section 2, question 23. So this question says philosopher, right? So a philosopher is talking to us. This philosopher says an action is morally right if it would be reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of the people affected by it. Okay, so this sentence right here is telling me a situation in which something would definitely be morally right, right? Now, there's a key word here that sticks out to me, and that is, aside from just if, the if is telling me the situation in which something is morally right. Oh, shoot, one sec. My desk is going crazy. Okay. It's telling me the situation in which something is morally right. But the phrase that's sticking out to me is reasonably expected. The reason that sticks out to me is maybe just because of the LSAT, but this isn't talking about a situation in which the aggregate well-being actually increases. You guys see that? Like, I don't care if it goes down, stays the same, or gets better. Even if it gets better, if it is not something that is reasonably expected to get better, then I don't know whether something is morally right or not. This is only about reasonable expectations. So if something is reasonably expected to make life better for those involved, but turns out not doing so, it's still morally right. Sound good? So this is really about state of mind. Okay, next sentence. An action is morally wrong if, and only if, it would be reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being of people affected by it. Well, this is a stronger claim than the first one because of the phrase if and only if. So if these certain circumstances are met, then, if it's reasonably expected to make people less well off, the people involved less well off, then it's morally wrong. And that's the only time that something is morally wrong. That's what the only if is saying, right? So this sentence is saying a lot more than the first. The first one was telling me, hey, here's a situation in which something is morally right, but there could be other situations that make things morally right. This next sentence is saying, hey, here's a situation that makes things morally wrong. And by the way, it's also the only situation that makes things morally wrong. So nothing else can make something morally wrong. As long as it's reasonably expected to reduce aggregate well-being, then it is morally wrong. Nothing else matters. Okay. Well, conclusion. Thus, actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them are also right. Okay, this conclusion is really based on the second sentence. The first sentence almost seems like a distraction. It's the second sentence that has all the power. The second sentence is telling us these are the only circumstances in which things are morally wrong. So if you fall outside of those circumstances, does that make them morally right? Selma, you're shaking your head. You're saying no? Why not?
Not necessarily. I think we don't know enough to say that it would be morally right. I think we could probably say that it's not going to be morally wrong, but we can't say that it's right.
That's exactly right. So if we fall outside of these circumstances, right, and the circumstances are when it's reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being of the people affected by the situation, when you fall outside of those situations, we know that they are not morally wrong because these are the only circumstances under which things are morally wrong. But this conclusion went a little too far. It was like, hey, we're talking about a situation that falls outside of the morally wrong situation. Therefore, drum roll, it's morally right. And it's like, yeah, okay, hold up. We know it's not morally wrong, but does that make it morally right? No, it could be this neutral ground where we don't know the morality of anything. It's just not wrong. Unless there are only two options in the world. If there are only two options in the world, morally right or morally wrong, then yeah, it would be morally right. But we don't know that. The question says the philosopher's conclusion follows logically, in other words, must be true, if which one of the following is assumed. Okay, so this is a sufficient assumption question. That means it's asking me for an assumption. It's asking me for an answer choice that if it were added to the argument would make the conclusion follow logically. It would make the conclusion true. We just talked about how, hey, we do know that this situation is not morally wrong. We just don't know that it's morally right. So an answer choice that says something like, hey, there are only two possibilities in the universe. Actions are either morally right or they're morally wrong. Then the conclusion would follow logically. Okay. That's my prediction. Let's take a look at these answers. A, only wrong actions would be reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them. I think that is, maybe I'm, I don't know, wrong. Maybe morally. This is a little weird because I'd like it to say morally wrong. But in any case, this is something that, if it is true, is supported by the second sentence of the passage. But it's not something that, if it were true, would make these actions that fall outside of this situation right. We still have the same problem. Just because you're not wrong doesn't mean you're right. Okay, B, no action is both right and wrong. Oh, that's kind of the opposite of what I was looking for. I was looking for an action is either right or wrong. So that's not right. Anyways, C, any action that is not morally wrong is morally right. Okay, Selma, that's what you said. That's the problem. And if that were added to the argument, the conclusion would now make sense. It would follow logically. So that's the answer. Let's see why D and E are wrong really quick. There are actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them. Okay, all that D does is say, hey, by the way, these kinds of actions exists on occasion. If anyone was tempted by this answer, you're probably thinking about this question like a necessary assumption question as opposed to a sufficient assumption question. You're probably asking yourself, oh, does this have to be true? Do these kinds of things have to exist? And that's not what it's asking. It's asking what, if it did exist, would make the conclusion true. Okay. Anyways, E, only right actions have good consequences. We actually don't care about the consequences at all in this argument. You guys are aware of that, right? This was all about states of mind. How things can be expected, not whether they actually are. So that's out. The answer is C. Questions on this question? Jermaine.
Could you please go over A one more time? Like I like C a lot better than A, but I can't pinpoint exactly. I know why C is right, but A just kind of still throws me off a little bit when I check it.
Sure. Jermaine, what is the problem with this argument in a nutshell?
Well, I believe it's saying, okay, so it's saying morally right is reasonably expected. Then it's saying it's morally wrong only if and only if it's reasonably expected to reduce well-being.
Yep.
So then they're assuming that, or they're automatically concluding that it will be reasonably, if it's not morally wrong, I guess they're reasonably, it's morally right, essentially, is what they're saying. I don't know how to explain it in the words, but...
No, you're doing it. So that's what they did in this argument. The conclusion did talk about a scenario that fell outside of things that are morally wrong. So we know that if the aggregate well-being remains unchanged, then the action is not morally wrong. But that's where the argument's conclusion made a big jump. Instead of saying, hey, when things are unchanged, the action must not have been morally wrong. It jumped to the conclusion to say that it is in fact morally right. And so the problem with answer choice A is it still doesn't get us to what is right. It just continues to talk about what is wrong or what is not wrong. I mean, you could infer what's not wrong from A. You could say, well, if only wrong actions do this, then everything else must not be wrong. But that still doesn't show that it's right. That's the big problem here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, very cool. Any other questions on this one?